Abandoned and broken, Shadow's fight for survival led to a fight for justice. Now, it's time for a second chance at life. It was a rainy night, and the narrow alley felt silent and eerie. Officer Jack Reynolds received a call about strange noises in the area. He grabbed his flashlight and walked cautiously into the darkness. As he moved deeper into the alley, his light landed on a German shepherd slumped against the wall. The dog was wet, weak, and looked malnourished. Jack could see the dog had a K9 unit collar. The dog's eyes were wide and full of pain, sending a clear message, a desperate plea for help. Jack froze, knowing something was terribly wrong. Jack felt a deep sense of responsibility and sorrow as he crouched beside the dog. The poor animal was in terrible shape, shivering in the cold rain. Jack gently spoke to the dog, trying to calm it down. His heart ached as he noticed how weak and thin the dog was. As Jack reached out to comfort it, his hand brushed against something on the ground. It was a torn piece of fabric, damp and dirty. He picked it up carefully and saw a faint logo on it. Jack squinted, recognizing the logo. It belonged to Blackridge Security, a private company. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just any stray dog, this was a K9 unit dog, abandoned and left to suffer. The dog, who Jack would later name Shadow, had been treated inhumanely. His heart sank as he thought about how Shadow must have been used and discarded like a tool, no longer needed. Jack knew this wasn't just a random case of neglect, there was something darker at play. Jack quickly grabbed his radio and called Officer Tim Carter for backup. He reported what he had found, explaining the condition of the dog and the connection to Blackridge Security. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was more than just rescuing a dog, it was about uncovering the truth behind the abuse and finding out who was responsible for Shadow's suffering. Jack promised himself that he wouldn't rest until he got answers. Shadow deserved justice, and Jack was determined to be the one to give it to him. Jack spent hours at his desk, the dim light above flickering as he tried to piece together the mystery surrounding Shadow. The K9 dog's tag told a troubling story. It revealed Shadow's previous role as a highly trained police dog. The tag was old and worn, but Jack could still make out the markings clearly. Shadow had once been a part of a K9 unit, serving alongside police officers. Jack couldn't understand why such a trained dog had been abandoned in such a brutal condition. As Jack flipped through the paperwork and tried to make sense of everything, Emily from Animal Services arrived at the station with an update. She explained that Shadow's condition was even worse than expected. The dog had been severely malnourished, likely starved for weeks. Emily had also found signs that Shadow had been restrained for a long period of time. The pressure sores on his legs were proof that he had been tied down or locked in a cage. Shadow was scarred, both physically and mentally. Emily's report made Jack's stomach turn. It was clear now, this wasn't just neglect, it was abuse. Jack's mind raced as he thought back to the torn piece of fabric he had found near Shadow. The faint logo on it had been from Blackridge Security, a private company with a reputation for cutting corners and doing things on the cheap. He couldn't shake the feeling that Blackridge had something to do with Shadow's suffering. Jack knew that Blackridge was a security company that trained K9 dogs, but he hadn't realized how far their disregard for their animals might go. Jack decided to dig deeper into Blackridge's operations. He and Tim spent the next few days investigating everything they could find about the company. What they uncovered was shocking. They learned that Blackridge had a pattern of mistreating its K9 dogs. Some were overworked, others were ignored, and many were discarded when they became too old or too injured to work. The more Jack dug, the more it became clear that Blackridge wasn't just failing its dogs, they were using them like tools, getting rid of them when they no longer served their purpose. Jack and Tim found multiple cases where dogs were being sold off to third parties, sometimes without any records of the sale. In some cases, the dogs were sent to auctions. It seemed that once a dog reached the point where Blackridge no longer found it useful, they just got rid of it. There were reports of former handlers who had tried to speak out but were silenced. The company had a well-established system for covering up its mistakes, and its shady practices had gone unnoticed for years. The worst part was that they found evidence suggesting that Shadow wasn't the only one. Jack realized that there had been other K9s who had suffered the same fate. Some had disappeared entirely, and their whereabouts were unknown. Others had been sold off or abandoned in places where no one would find them. Jack felt a deep sense of anger building inside him. This wasn't just a case of one dog being mistreated. It was part of a much larger problem, one that was rooted in the heart of Blackridge's operations. Jack knew they had to expose the truth. Shadow's story had to be told, and the people responsible for his suffering needed to be held accountable. It wasn't just about saving one dog, it was about stopping a cycle of cruelty that had gone on for far too long. With Tim by his side, Jack was more determined than ever to uncover everything about Blackridge and put an end to their inhumane practices once and for all. Jack knew he had to get answers from Blackridge Security, so he arranged a meeting with Andrew Cole, the regional operations manager. When Jack walked into Blackridge's office, the atmosphere was cold and tense. The building felt like a fortress, and the receptionist barely acknowledged him as he flashed his badge. Jack was led into a sleek, modern office where Cole sat behind a large desk, his expression calm but guarded. "Detective Reynolds," Cole said with a firm handshake. "What can I help you with today?" Jack wasted no time. "I'm investigating a K9 that was found in terrible condition. It was once part of your unit." He placed the torn fabric with the Blackridge logo on the desk between them. "This was found near the dog. It came from your company." Cole looked at the fabric but didn't react. "We don't have any missing dogs," he said flatly. "If one of our K9s was in distress, we would know about it." Jack didn't buy it. He leaned forward, keeping his voice steady. "The dog I found wasn't just in distress, it was starved, injured, and abandoned. And I've uncovered that your company has been selling K9s, like that one, on the black market." Cole stiffened slightly but quickly masked his discomfort. "That's a serious accusation," he said, his voice a little sharper. "We follow all regulations." "I'm sure you're mistaken." Jack didn't back down. "I've seen the evidence. Former employees, records, and now I know that your company has been sending retired or injured K9s to auctions, no questions asked. It's a network, and Shadow was part of it." Cole's face remained impassive, but Jack could see a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Cole," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I need the truth. How do you explain a K9 like Shadow being abandoned in an alley? Was he sold off like property? What happened to him?" Cole paused, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. There was silence for a moment, and then Cole spoke again, his voice more measured. "If there was an issue with one of our K9s, it would have been handled. I'll look into it and get back to you." Jack didn't believe him. It was clear that Cole was hiding something. "You're not answering my question," Jack said, leaning in closer. "Was Shadow marked for external auction?" Cole's expression tightened. "I said I'll look into it," he repeated, but Jack wasn't satisfied. He knew that if Blackridge was hiding something, it wouldn't be easy to find, but he had to push further. Later, after the meeting, Jack took a closer look at the paperwork he had gathered. It didn't take long for him to find the smoking gun. Shadow's file had a note, marked for external auction. That confirmed everything Jack had suspected. Blackridge had sold off their K9s, dogs like Shadow that were no longer useful to them, not for adoption or proper retirement, but to the highest bidder, through secret auctions. Jack's anger grew. This wasn't just neglect. This was deliberate abuse, a system where dogs were treated like tools, used up, and then discarded when they were no longer needed. Blackridge had turned its back on the very animals they had trained to serve and protect. Shadow was only one example, but Jack now knew that many others had suffered the same fate. Jack called Tim to share the news. Shadow was marked for auction. Blackridge sold him off, and I'm going to prove it, Jack said, his voice resolute. The more Jack dug, the clearer it became, this was a corporate cover-up on a massive scale. And Jack was determined to uncover everything, no matter how deep it went. The truth about Blackridge Security was far from over, and Jack wasn't backing down. Jack wasn't ready to back down. He knew Blackridge was hiding something, and he was determined to find the truth. With the help of Tim and Emily, Jack dove deeper into the company's records. They spent hours sifting through files, looking for anything that could prove that Blackridge was involved in illegal activity. The more they looked, the worse things got. They found evidence of widespread abuse, including K9s that had been overworked, injured, and then discarded when they were no longer useful. Some records showed that dogs had disappeared without explanation, and others had been sold off through shady channels. Jack's heart sank as he read through the files. This wasn't just a few mistakes, it was a pattern of cruelty. While Tim and Emily continued to dig through the records, Jack decided to track down someone who might know more about Blackridge's dark secrets. He remembered a name from one of the employee complaints, Michael Briggs, a former handler who had worked for Blackridge before leaving the company under mysterious circumstances. Briggs had filed complaints about the company's practices in the past, but nothing had ever come of it. Jack hoped he might have more information about what was really going on inside Blackridge. It didn't take long for Jack to find Briggs' address. He and Tim drove out to the small house on the outskirts of town. As they approached, they saw a German shepherd barking behind a chain-link fence. It was clear that Briggs still had dogs, and Jack hoped this might help them make a connection. Briggs appeared soon after, a thin man in his late 40s, with a wary look in his eyes. Jack introduced himself and explained the reason for the visit. At first, Briggs was hesitant to talk. He seemed scared, like he didn't want to get involved. But after a little pushing, he finally opened up. Blackridge doesn't care about the dogs, Briggs said, shaking his head. I left because of how they treated them. They pushed them too hard, ignored injuries, and when a dog couldn't keep up anymore, they just got rid of them. Jack's stomach turned. He could tell that Briggs was holding back, but it was clear that Blackridge had been mistreating their K9s for a long time. What do you mean by getting rid of them? Jack asked. Briggs hesitated, looking over his shoulder before answering. Sometimes they were sold off to whoever would pay. No questions asked. Other times, they just disappeared. If a dog wasn't useful anymore, they'd either sell it or just dump it. Shadow was probably one of those dogs. Jack felt his anger rise. This wasn't just mistreatment, it was a system of abuse that had been happening for years. Briggs' words confirmed everything Jack had feared. Blackridge was selling off their retired or injured K9s like they were worthless. Shadow's abandonment wasn't an accident, it was part of a much larger, darker pattern. Armed with this new information, Jack knew he couldn't stop now. He took everything he had gathered, the records, Briggs' testimony, and the evidence of abuse, and brought it to the district attorney's office. This was no longer just a case of animal cruelty, it was a full-scale criminal investigation. Jack pushed for action, and after reviewing the evidence, the district attorney agreed to launch a formal investigation into Blackridge Security. The wheels of justice were finally turning. Jack felt a sense of relief, but he also knew this was just the beginning. He was determined to make sure that Blackridge would be held accountable for their actions, and that Shadow, and all the other dogs like him, would get the justice they deserved. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with tension. Jack sat with the district attorney, looking over the evidence they had collected against Blackridge Security. It was time to make the company pay for what they had done to Shadow and countless other K-9s. The prosecution began by presenting their case, laying out the facts one by one. They had strong evidence, records showing the abuse of retired and injured dogs, testimony from former employees like Michael Briggs, and photographs of Shadow in his terrible condition when he was found. The most powerful evidence, however, was Shadow himself. His story had become the face of the case. As the trial went on, witnesses took the stand to testify about Blackridge's cruel practices. Former employees described how the company pushed their K-9s too hard, ignoring their injuries and overworking them until they couldn't perform anymore. Veterinary experts were brought in to explain the physical damage done to the dogs. Shadow's condition was used as the main example of Blackridge's negligence. His recovery was a testament to his strength, but it also highlighted the severe mistreatment he had endured. The experts explained how Shadow's injuries, malnutrition, and scars were clear signs of prolonged abuse and neglect. The most emotional part of the trial came when Emily from Animal Services took the stand. She spoke about Shadow's recovery, showing the photos of his condition when he was first found. The courtroom was silent as the images were shown, images of a dog left to suffer, covered in scars, and near death. Shadow's journey from the alley to recovery was proof that he had been treated like nothing more than an object to Blackridge, something to be discarded when no longer useful. Jack was in the courtroom every day, watching the trial unfold. He could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him. Shadow's suffering wasn't just about one dog, it was about the entire system of abuse that Blackridge had created. It wasn't just negligence, it was exploitation. And Jack wasn't going to let them get away with it. The defense tried to argue that Blackridge had followed all proper procedures, but their arguments didn't hold up against the evidence. The prosecution had shown a clear pattern of abuse, and it was impossible for the defense to deny the truth. As the trial came to a close, the judge took some time to review the evidence before delivering the verdict. The courtroom held its breath as the judge read the decision. The court finds Blackridge Security guilty of animal cruelty, neglect, and exploitation, the judge said. The company is hereby ordered to shut down its K-9 operations immediately. In addition, the company will face significant fines and criminal charges for their actions. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. The fight for Shadow and the other K-9s had been long and hard, but it was worth it. Blackridge was being held accountable for the suffering they had caused. The decision was a victory for justice, but Jack knew it wasn't the end. There would still be work to do to ensure that the company would never hurt another dog again. As the court session ended, the reporters gathered outside, eager to get their stories. Jack walked away from the courthouse with a sense of pride, knowing that Shadow's case had made a difference. This wasn't just a win for him, it was a win for all the animals who couldn't speak for themselves. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Jack felt like they were on the right path. 2 weeks after the trial, Jack walked into the vet clinic with a sense of hope. The fight for Shadow was over, and it was time for the dog to finally leave the place where he had been recovering. Shadow had come a long way from the sad, starving dog Jack had found in the alley. His wounds had healed, and his strength had returned. The once weak and broken dog was now strong, with a healthy coat and bright eyes that seemed full of life again. As Jack walked into the back room of the clinic, he saw Shadow lying on a soft blanket. The German shepherd's tail wagged weakly when he noticed Jack. The bond between them had grown over the past few weeks. Shadow trusted him now, and Jack knew it was time to give him the life he deserved. He knelt beside the dog, smiling softly. "Hey, buddy," Jack said, gently scratching behind Shadow's ears. "You're going home today." Shadow looked up at him with those soulful eyes, as if he understood exactly what Jack was saying. It was hard to believe that just a short time ago, Shadow had been in such bad shape, abandoned and forgotten. But now, he was going to have a second chance, a chance to live the life he deserved. The clinic staff watched as Jack prepared to take Shadow home. They cheered him on, happy to see the dog recovering so well. Shadow had become a symbol of hope and resilience, not just for Jack, but for all the animals who had suffered at the hands of Blackridge Security. As Jack gently attached the leash to Shadow's collar, the dog stood up, his movements a little stiff but determined. Jack smiled as he led him out of the clinic and into the car. Shadow climbed into the passenger seat, settling down for the ride. The sun had started to set, and the city lights began to flicker in the distance. Jack looked over at Shadow, who rested his head on Jack's arm. "We made it, buddy," Jack said softly. "We did it." The road ahead seemed brighter now, not just for Shadow, but for all the dogs that would no longer suffer at the hands of people who didn't care. The victory wasn't just in the courtroom, it was in the chance that Jack had given Shadow a second chance at life, free from cruelty. As they drove, Jack thought about everything they had been through. The investigation, the trial, the pain of seeing Shadow in such bad shape, it had all been worth it. Justice had been served, not just for Shadow, but for all the other K9s who had suffered under Blackridge's care. Jack knew that Shadow's story would inspire others to fight for animals who couldn't speak for themselves. When they reached Jack's house, he opened the door for Shadow to step out. The dog looked around at his new home, his tail wagging gently. Jack smiled, knowing this was just the beginning of a new chapter for Shadow. The dog who had been abandoned and forgotten was now part of a family that would love and care for him forever. As Jack looked at Shadow, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had won. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt that everything he had done, everything he had fought for, had been worth it. Shadow was home, and justice had been served.